The bank manager almost smiled when Walter Boone slid the envelope across the folding auction table. It was raining outside the county equipment barn, the kind of cold Arkansas rain that turned gravel lots into black mud. Most of the bidders standing near the coffee urn wore pressed jackets and polished boots. Walter wore an old canvas coat with a broken zipper and carried a yellow legal pad folded beneath one arm. Inside the envelope was a certified deposit check for $8,000. Not enough to impress anyone bidding on 600 acres tied to a future interstate freight corridor. One of the junior banking attorneys glanced at the amount and laughed quietly into his paper cup. Walter heard it. So did his grandson. But Walter only nodded once and asked a single question. County survey map still included with the parcel records? The attorney barely looked up. Everything's public record, Mr. Boone. What nobody inside that room understood yet was that Walter had already spent 4 months inside those records. And somewhere in a rusted filing cabinet beneath the old county courthouse sat a handwritten easement amendment from 1978 that could stop the entire project cold. By the time the bank realized why Walter Boone had attended that auction, their $60 million development schedule was already beginning to collapse. The story opens slowly inside the county agricultural surplus building outside Millhaven, Arkansas. Rain taps against the metal roof while folding chairs scrape concrete floors. Representatives from regional construction firms stand around coffee stations discussing freight projections and future warehouse expansion tied to a proposed interstate connector. Walter Boone arrives alone except for his 16-year-old grandson, Eli. Walter is a widower, former survey assistant, and part-time cattle farmer barely holding onto 80 inherited acres bordering the proposed development corridor. His truck rattles when it idles. His boots are cracked from years of field repairs. The room dismisses him immediately. The auction involves foreclosure land absorbed by Prairie State Regional Bank after a developer defaulted during financing disputes. The bank believes the parcel is essential to a massive industrial logistics project already quietly negotiated with transportation investors. Walter submits the minimum certified deposit required to enter bidding. The young banking attorney handling registration, Trevor Pike, openly smirks at the amount. Another bidder jokes that Walter probably came for the free donuts. Eli reacts emotionally, but Walter calmly tells him. People talk loud when paperwork's thin. That line quietly lingers. The chapter builds atmosphere carefully. Styrofoam coffee cups. Wet wool jackets. Fluorescent courthouse lighting. Muddy truck tires outside. Folded county maps spread across plastic tables. Walter never aggressively bids. Instead, he watches. He asks procedural questions. Were utility easements updated? Which survey year governs drainage access? Did the county refile corridor rights after the 1982 flood revisions? The bank representatives become irritated because Walter's questions delay the auction. Trevor dismisses him publicly. Mr. Boone, this isn't really a history seminar. People laugh again. But one older county clerk in the room notices Walter's wording carefully. After the auction, Walter does something strange. He doesn't complain about losing. Instead, he visits the county records office before it closes. The records office atmosphere becomes central. Humming fluorescent lights. Ancient filing drawers. Dust-covered plat books. Handwritten labels from the late 1970s. Old women stamping property requests manually. Walter requests 3 obscure files connected to drainage maintenance agreements, abandoned rail access corridors, agricultural crossing exemptions. The clerk becomes uneasy because few people know those records exist. Walter quietly copies several handwritten pages into a notebook. That night at home, Eli asks why Walter spent money entering an auction he never intended to win. Walter finally reveals the first major clue. Because bidders can request disclosure packets. Inside the disclosure packet was a survey map the bank accidentally included. And on that map, Walter noticed a boundary notation that should not exist anymore. A notation referencing conditional easement continuity, Boone Agricultural Access Revision, 1978. Eli doesn't fully understand. Neither does the audience. But Walter pulls an old metal box from beneath his bed containing yellowed receipts, county letters, flood repair permits, handwritten route sketches from his late father. One folded paper carries the same notation. The chapter ends with Walter placing two documents side by side at the kitchen table beneath dim light while rain hits the windows. The language matches perfectly. And for the first time, Walter quietly says, "They built their project on land they don't fully control." Curiosity explodes because the audience still doesn't know exactly what the easement does, or how dangerous it might become. The chapter begins before sunrise. Walter drives Eli to the old county library annex 2 towns away because archived land commission records were transferred there during courthouse renovations in the 1990s. The building smells like dust, mildew, and burned coffee. An elderly archivist recognizes the Boone family name and remembers Walter's father working floodplain surveys decades earlier. Walter requests transportation corridor revisions from 1977 to 1981. The archivist seems surprised because almost nobody researches those years anymore. Through procedural scenes and restrained narration, the audience learns. The interstate connector was originally routed differently. Several farming families negotiated agricultural crossing protections. Flood drainage access became legally tied to emergency maintenance routes. And certain easements could not legally be terminated without multi-party filings. Walter discovers something critical: the Boone easement was never fully extinguished. Instead, a reclassification request stalled after a county funding freeze in 1983. Meaning, the legal corridor may still technically exist. The problem becomes enormous. Because Prairie State's industrial project relies on uninterrupted access through the exact corridor governed by that forgotten agricultural easement. Walter still doesn't act publicly. Instead, he quietly documents everything. Photocopies, timestamps, clerk signatures, archive references, transportation memos. Eli begins understanding his grandfather differently. Walter isn't lucky. He's methodical. A key emotional scene occurs at a diner after library research. Eli asks, "If you already found this, why not tell them?" Walter stirs black coffee for several seconds before answering. Because people protect mistakes differently once money's attached. That line reframes the story. Meanwhile, the bank accelerates development announcements. Local newspapers celebrate projected jobs and warehouse construction. Survey crews begin appearing near Boone property lines. Construction contractors start preliminary grading discussions. But subtle problems emerge. Title insurers request clarification. County reviewers delay permit signatures. One transportation consultant quietly resigns. Internal legal emails begin circulating. Trevor Pike initially ignores the issue. He assumes Walter is just filing nuisance objections. Then Walter sends a formal records preservation notice. Not a lawsuit. Just a preservation notice. That scares the bank's senior counsel because it signals organized documentation. Corporate tension rises quietly. Conference room meetings. Whispered conversations. Legal folders stacked late at night. Executives reviewing old plats under fluorescent light. The bank hires outside counsel to investigate. Their researchers discover the same thing Walter found: the easement trail never cleanly disappeared. But they still underestimate him because they believe a quiet settlement can eliminate the issue quickly. Near the end of the chapter, Trevor visits Walter personally at the farm. The scene stays restrained. No yelling. No threats. Just cold politeness. Trevor offers reimbursement for research inconvenience. Walter declines immediately. Trevor then asks, "What exactly do you want here?" Walter looks toward drainage fields behind the barn. Compliance. Trevor leaves irritated because he still thinks Walter is bluffing. After he drives away, Eli notices Walter watching the departing car carefully. Walter says, "They still think this is about money." The chapter closes with Walter opening another forgotten county archive box. Inside sits a folded engineering map marked, Emergency Flood Diversion Access, Permanent Agricultural Protection Route. And the marked route cuts directly through the center of Prairie State's future freight entrance. Winter settled over Millhaven slowly. The fields around Walter Boone's property turned gray beneath low skies while survey stakes appeared across the corridor every few hundred feet like silent warnings. Freight investors from 3 states had already toured the proposed site. County officials publicly praised the project during Chamber of Commerce breakfasts. Prairie State Regional Bank circulated projected revenue charts to investors showing warehouse completion timelines 18 months ahead of schedule. And still, Walter said almost nothing. That silence became the bank's first real problem. The chapter opens with Walter inside the county engineering office carrying a cardboard document box tied with faded string. He wears the same weathered canvas coat from the auction. Snowmelt drips from his boots onto the linoleum floor while younger clerks barely look at him. He files a procedural petition requesting historical easement verification, emergency access continuity review, drainage corridor enforcement clarification, and transportation compliance certification. The clerk handling intake initially assumes it is routine paperwork. Then she notices attached supporting exhibits. Certified archive copies. County flood maps. Transportation Commission minutes. Signed agricultural preservation references. And engineering annotations from 1978. Nearly 200 pages. Everything indexed by hand. Walter has even tabbed the exhibits with colored paper markers. The county engineer asks quietly, "Who prepared all this?" Walter answers simply, "My father started it. I finished it." The petition triggers an automatic review hold on corridor approvals until the easement question can be clarified. At first, Prairie State executives believe the delay will last a few days. Then the Transportation Department requests additional verification. Then title insurers request updated exposure analysis. Then environmental reviewers suspend preliminary grading authorization. The chain reaction begins. Inside Prairie State headquarters, tension finally enters the room. The bank's legal division occupies the 6th floor of a polished glass building in Little Rock where conference tables shine beneath recessed lighting. Trevor Pike now sits beside senior attorneys instead of junior associates. Large corridor maps cover the walls. Legal pads fill with handwritten notes. A senior partner asks the question nobody previously considered. Why did this survive 40 years without resolution? No one has a clean answer. Because the issue was never truly closed. It was forgotten. And forgotten paperwork is dangerous. The narrative carefully shows procedural panic rather than dramatic explosions. Delayed signatures. Rescheduled investor meetings. Consultants speaking cautiously. Compliance reviewers suddenly unavailable. Engineers revising entrance schematics late into the night. The bank still believes Walter can be pressured privately. Trevor returns to the Boone property carrying a thicker folder this time. The meeting takes place beside Walter's machine shed during freezing rain. Eli watches from the barn doorway while Walter repairs an old fence hinge without hurrying. Trevor speaks carefully now. No smirking. No jokes. He offers land purchase incentives, relocation assistance, infrastructure compensation, legal fee reimbursement. Walter never interrupts him. When Trevor finishes, Walter wipes cold grease from his hands with a rag and asks, "Did your people read the flood diversion clauses?" Trevor pauses. That hesitation tells Walter everything. They still have not found the worst document. Walter quietly explains that emergency agricultural access rights connected to federally supported flood diversion corridors cannot simply be extinguished through private financing restructures. Especially if continuity filings were never completed. Trevor responds carefully. "We believe your interpretation is outdated." Walter nods once. "Then you shouldn't have trouble proving it." The emotional restraint keeps the tension sharp. No threats. No triumph. Just procedural confidence. Meanwhile, Eli begins helping Walter organize evidence at night. Their kitchen table becomes a recurring visual motif. Coffee rings on legal pads. Folded county maps. Handwritten notes. Property abstracts. Dusty engineering manuals. Old receipts weighed down by salt shakers. Walter teaches Eli how to cross-reference parcel revisions against transportation filings. The audience slowly realizes Walter spent years learning these systems quietly after his wife's death and during failing farm seasons nobody noticed. He was never powerless. Only ignored. Midway through the chapter comes the first major public escalation. Prairie State attempts to move forward despite the review hold by announcing preliminary utility preparation. Within 48 hours, Walter files another procedural objection referencing emergency drainage interference risk tied to the preserved agricultural corridor. That objection forces the county to suspend utility trench approvals pending independent review. Construction contractors begin losing money. Investors start asking questions. A local newspaper finally publishes a small article, "Historic Easement Review Delays Freight Corridor Approval." Walter's name appears near the bottom. Trevor reads the article 3 times. Because now the issue exists publicly. And once procedural uncertainty becomes public, financing institutions become nervous. The chapter introduces a new figure, Marianne Voss, Prairie State's External Infrastructure Counsel. Unlike Trevor, she immediately understands Walter is dangerous. Not because he is aggressive. Because he is patient. She studies his filings carefully and notices something unsettling: Walter never exaggerates. Every statement is narrow. Precise. Documented. That makes him credible. Marianne personally visits the county archive office and discovers multiple records boxes already checked out under Walter's name weeks earlier. Meaning, he anticipated the conflict long before the auction occurred. The realization shifts the power dynamic completely. The bank did not stumble into a dispute. Walter walked into the auction already prepared for one. Late in the chapter, Eli asks the question the audience has been wondering. "Grandpa, when did you start looking into this?" Walter sits quietly beside the wood stove for several seconds before answering. "The day they surveyed through your grandmother's pasture." A subtle emotional beat lands there. This was never sudden revenge. This was long-term protection. The final escalation arrives during a closed county review session. Prairie State submits revised engineering documents attempting to bypass the disputed corridor section. But one reviewer notices the alternate route still intersects the emergency flood diversion access map Walter uncovered. The room falls silent. Because the problem may be larger than everyone thought. A senior county official quietly asks, "Has anyone confirmed whether federal maintenance language is still attached?" Nobody answers immediately. That silence becomes catastrophic. The chapter ends with Marianne Voss calling Prairie State executives after midnight from her office overlooking rain-covered streets. Legal folders surround her desk. Highlighted statutes remain open beside cold coffee. And for the first time in the story, someone inside the corporation says the words out loud. "If Boone is right, this project cannot legally open on schedule." Spring arrived slowly across Millhaven. The rain stopped first. Then came the freight trucks. Every morning, long flatbeds carrying steel barriers and utility pipe rolled down county roads toward the unfinished logistics corridor while local diners filled with subcontractors discussing schedules already falling behind. Prairie State Regional Bank publicly insisted the delays were temporary. Press releases described the easement review as routine procedural clarification. But privately, the atmosphere inside the corporation had changed completely. No one laughed at Walter Boone anymore. The chapter opens inside Prairie State's executive conference room where updated delay projections are spread across a polished walnut table. The numbers are no longer theoretical. Contractor penalties. Investor exposure. Idle equipment costs. Revised environmental review deadlines. Transportation grant contingencies. Every additional week threatens millions. Trevor Pike looks exhausted now. His tie hangs loose beneath fluorescent lighting while Marianne Voss leads a tense procedural briefing. She explains that the central danger is no longer the agricultural easement itself. It is the possibility that the corridor remained tied to federal flood control maintenance language from the late 1970s. If true, Prairie State may require federal review, environmental reassessment, corridor redesign, or emergency access preservation compliance, which could freeze portions of the project indefinitely. An executive interrupts angrily. How did a retired farmer find this before our legal department? Nobody answers. Because everyone already knows the truth. Walter looked where they never bothered to look. Back in Millhaven, Walter continues living normally. He repairs fencing, feeds cattle, drinks coffee at the same diner each morning. That emotional restraint becomes psychologically powerful because the corporation is collapsing into anxiety while Walter remains calm. Eli notices it too. One evening while organizing photocopies at the kitchen table, Eli asks, "You ever get nervous?" Walter studies an old survey notation before answering. Being nervous doesn't change paperwork. The line quietly reinforces his entire personality. The story then transitions into one of the most important investigative sequences so far. Walter receives a call from the elderly archivist at the county library annex. During courthouse basement cleanup, workers discovered additional storage boxes transferred during flood renovations decades earlier. Some are labeled, Transportation Commission, Deferred Rural Access Filings. Walter drives there immediately with Eli. The basement atmosphere becomes intensely cinematic. Flickering pull-chain lights. Concrete floors damp from groundwater. Rusted shelving. Handwritten labels fading from cardboard. Dust floating through flashlight beams. Ancient filing cabinets jammed half open. The archivist explains many records were never fully indexed after the 1984 courthouse flood. Walter begins carefully opening boxes one by one. Inside are surveyor notes, maintenance requests, engineering correspondence, drainage photographs, handwritten routing revisions. Hours pass. Then Walter finds something that changes everything. A stapled packet marked, Federal Emergency Diversion Coordination, Temporary Preservation Continuity. The packet includes signatures from county engineers, transportation officials, and agricultural representatives. One name belongs to Walter's late father. Eli watches his grandfather go completely still. The audience understands emotionally before the dialogue confirms it. Walter's father fought this exact issue decades earlier. The continuity language states that until replacement flood infrastructure became operational, agricultural emergency access routes tied to diversion channels would remain protected under Provisional Continuity Authority. The replacement infrastructure was never completed, meaning the old protections may still legally exist. Walter quietly places the document into a plastic sleeve without celebrating, because he understands what it means. The chapter slows for an emotional beat afterward. Walter and Eli stop at a roadside diner during the drive home. Rain taps softly against the windows while truck headlights move across the parking lot outside. Eli finally asks, "Why didn't Grandpa finish the fight?" Walter stares into untouched coffee. He died 3 months after filing the appeal. Silence sits between them. Then Walter adds, "Most people thought the county buried it after that." That emotional reveal reframes the entire narrative. Walter is not creating revenge. He is finishing unfinished work. Meanwhile, Marianne Voss intensifies her own investigation. Unlike the other corporate figures, she respects Walter now. She visits retired county employees, reviews archived engineering microfilm, cross-checks federal maintenance references. And slowly she reaches the same terrifying conclusion: Walter's interpretation may survive judicial review. Prairie State executives begin discussing settlement structures privately. Their offers escalate dramatically. property acquisition, lifetime agricultural stipends, trust funds for Eli's education, infrastructure contracts, confidentiality provisions. Walter refuses all of them. Not emotionally. Procedurally. Each refusal arrives through neatly typed responses referencing unresolved compliance obligations. That frustrates Prairie State even more because Walter cannot be painted as unreasonable. He is simply insisting the law be followed. The pressure starts spreading outward. County commissioners worry about public embarrassment. Contractors threaten litigation over delays. Transportation agencies request status updates. Local journalists begin researching the forgotten easement story. One reporter discovers that Prairie State purchased the corridor before final archival verification completed. That revelation damages investor confidence badly. The corporation now faces a secondary threat: they may appear negligent. Trevor visits Walter again, this time alone and without legal folders. The meeting happens beside an irrigation ditch at sunset while frogs hum across flooded pastureland. Trevor finally asks the honest question. What do you actually want this to become? Walter studies the water moving slowly beneath rusted drainage gates. Then he answers. I want people to stop building things on top of records they never read. Trevor almost laughs from exhaustion. But he cannot. Because 11 months of delay have already begun forming around Walter's filings. The chapter's final procedural escalation arrives during a state infrastructure coordination hearing. Prairie State attempts to narrow the review scope to local easement interpretation only. Then Walter submits the newly discovered federal continuity packet into official review records. The room changes instantly. Review attorneys begin whispering. State engineers request recesses. Transportation officials reread the language repeatedly. Mary Ann Voss closes her eyes briefly because she immediately understands the consequence. Federal continuity references trigger mandatory interagency review. Which means, the project timeline is no longer under Prairie State's control. An exhausted commissioner finally asks Walter where he found the documents. Walter answers quietly. Basement storage beneath the old courthouse. That answer humiliates the corporation more than any courtroom victory could. Because the evidence was always there. Someone simply cared enough to keep looking. The chapter ends late at night inside Prairie State headquarters. Rain streaks the glass walls while executives sit around silent conference tables reviewing revised delay estimates, 4 months, 6 months, possibly longer. Trevor stares at Walter's original $8,000 auction deposit photocopied inside the case file. The same deposit they laughed at. Mary Ann speaks softly without looking up from the documents. He never came there to buy the land. No one responds. Because they finally understand. Walter Boone attended the auction to enter the paperwork. And from the moment they accepted his deposit. The trap had already been se. By midsummer, the corridor looked abandoned. Construction fencing leaned sideways in the heat. Stacks of concrete drainage pipes sat untouched beside muddy access roads while weeds pushed through gravel staging areas that were supposed to become freight entrances months earlier. Half-installed utility markers faded beneath sun and rain. Contractors still arrived occasionally, but mostly to inspect delays rather than continue work. 11 months had now passed since Walter Boone placed his auction deposit on the folding table inside the county equipment barn. And Prairie State Regional Bank was bleeding money. The chapter opens with a slow montage of procedural exhaustion. Unanswered conference calls. Revised engineering binders. Contractors requesting extensions. Investors demanding exposure reports. County officials avoiding interviews. Legal assistants carrying archive boxes late at night. Nothing explodes dramatically. Everything simply grinds downward. That realism becomes emotionally heavier than loud confrontation. Meanwhile, Walter's life barely changes. He wakes before sunrise. Feeds cattle. Repairs fences. Drinks black coffee beside the same kitchen window. But subtle emotional wear begins appearing around him. Deeper pauses before speaking. Unread letters stacked beside the sink. Overdue equipment repairs. Mounting attorney correspondence. Sleepless nights organizing documents beneath dim light. Eli notices his grandfather rubbing his hands more often from arthritis while turning archive pages. The emotional restraint makes these details powerful because Walter never complains. One morning at the diner, several locals quietly thank Walter for standing up to Prairie State. Rumors have spread that the corporation planned to seize additional agricultural land after the freight corridor opened. Walter responds carefully. "Don't make heroes out of paperwork." That line spreads through town afterward. The chapter then shifts toward Prairie State's internal collapse. Marianne Voss uncovers a devastating chain of negligence hidden inside archived acquisition files. Years earlier, Prairie State's due diligence consultants flagged unresolved corridor continuity references during preliminary review. But executives pushed the purchase forward anyway because the easement issue appeared dormant. Dormant. That single word becomes catastrophic. Because it proves the bank was warned. Marianne confronts senior executives privately. The scene remains controlled and procedural. Fluorescent lights humming. Untouched catering trays. Spreadsheets projected across conference walls. Legal folders opened beside cold coffee cups. She explains that if litigation expands into discovery, the corporation may face negligence allegations, investor disclosure scrutiny, financing liability exposure, and regulatory review. An executive asks quietly, "Can we still beat him?" Marianne answers after a long silence. "That stopped being the right question months ago." Trevor Pike deteriorates emotionally throughout the chapter. He drives repeatedly through Millhaven observing the stalled corridor, the unused staging yards, and the farmland Prairie State once assumed would disappear quietly beneath development plans. He begins understanding Walter in a deeply uncomfortable way. Walter never rushed. Never threatened. Never grandstand. He simply documented everything more carefully than the corporation did. One evening Trevor stops outside Walter's property during heavy rain. The barn light glows softly through darkness while Walter and Eli organize filing boxes inside. Trevor does not approach immediately. He just watches. Because the contrast has become psychologically crushing, inside the corporation, everyone is panicking. Inside the barn, paperwork is simply being sorted. Eventually Trevor walks in carrying a leather folder. No lawyers. No assistants. No scripted language. He places the folder on the table. Inside is Prairie State's largest settlement offer yet. Lifetime land protections. Substantial financial compensation. Full project redesign concessions. Public historical preservation acknowledgments. And permanent drainage access recognition. Walter reads every page slowly. Eli watches silently. Rain pounds against the tin roof while old box fans hum near stacked filing cabinets. Finally Trevor asks, "What happens if this keeps going?" Walter closes the folder carefully. "They fix it properly." Trevor's frustration finally surfaces. "For God's sake, Boone, they've already lost millions." Walter studies him quietly before answering. "My father lost 30 years. Silence. That line lands harder than any courtroom speech. Trevor realizes the truth. Walter is not negotiating from anger. He is negotiating from unfinished time. The chapter's central reveal arrives through Marianne's continued investigation. While reviewing archived transportation minutes, she discovers an overlooked procedural defect tied to Prairie State's original corridor application. The bank certified uninterrupted emergency access compliance before final historical verification completed. Meaning, their own filings may now be internally inconsistent. That inconsistency threatens every major approval attached to the project timeline. Marianne understands immediately that if regulators reopen the certification process broadly, the delay could extend far beyond 11 months. Possibly years. Prairie State executives become desperate to avoid public hearings. But the issue is no longer controllable privately because local journalists have started connecting. The abandoned corridor. The forgotten easement. The archived federal continuity language. And Prairie State's ignored warnings. A major regional newspaper publishes a detailed investigation titled, "Rural Filing Dispute Freezes Major Freight Development." Walter's photograph appears beside the article, weathered face, canvas coat, holding rolled survey maps outside the county courthouse. He hates the attention instantly. At breakfast the next morning, Eli notices Walter folding the newspaper without reading the full article. "You should keep it," Eli says. Walter shakes his head. Paper matters more than headlines. That line reinforces the story's central philosophy. Near the end of the chapter comes the most emotionally important sequence yet. Walter finally opens the last unopened box belonging to his late father. Inside are engineering pencils, flood survey photographs, handwritten maintenance notes, county correspondence, and an unsent letter dated 1984. Walter reads it alone late at night while Eli sleeps. The letter was addressed to state transportation officials. In restrained language, Walter's father warned that abandoning agricultural flood continuity protections without proper replacement infrastructure would eventually create legal and environmental exposure for future corridor development. The warning was never mailed. Probably because illness overtook him first. Walter folds the letter carefully beside the kitchen lamp. For the first time in the story, emotion almost reaches the surface. Not rage. Not triumph. Grief. Quiet grief delayed for decades. The chapter's final escalation occurs during a closed mediation session between Prairie State attorneys, State Infrastructure Council, and county officials. Everyone enters expecting settlement negotiation. Instead, Mary Ann Voss privately informs Prairie State executives that regulators are considering temporary suspension of broader corridor certifications until compliance reconciliation completes. The room goes silent. Because now the threat is no longer merely financial. The entire $60 million development could collapse structurally. Trevor looks across the conference table toward Walter. Walter sits calmly beside stacked binders and handwritten notes, wearing the same old canvas coat from the auction nearly a year earlier. Nothing about him appears victorious. Only patient. A state reviewer finally asks Walter one last question. When did you realize the project could actually be stopped? Walter thinks for several seconds before answering softly. The day they laughed at the deposit. The chapter closes with sunset over the unfinished corridor. Wind moves through tall grass growing between idle machinery while orange construction fencing flaps slowly against rusted stakes. 11 months earlier, Prairie State believed Walter Boone was just an old farmer chasing paperwork. Now an entire development schedule stands frozen around documents his family protected for nearly half a century. And the final decision has not even arrived yet. Autumn returned to Millhaven almost exactly 1 year after the auction. Cold wind moved through harvested soybean fields while abandoned construction fencing rattled beside unfinished service roads. The freight corridor remained silent except for maintenance crews occasionally inspecting drainage trenches slowly filling with weeds and rainwater. The $60 million development had not officially died. But everyone in Arkansas infrastructure circles understood the truth. It had stopped breathing months earlier. The chapter opens before sunrise inside Walter Boone's kitchen. The old tea kettle whistles softly while he reviews one final binder beneath yellow overhead light. Eli sleeps on the couch nearby surrounded by archive boxes and rolled survey maps. Coffee rings stain the table where hundreds of pages had been organized over the previous year. Easement continuity records. Flood diversion filings. Transportation Commission minutes. Engineering annotations. Federal maintenance references. Handwritten notes from Walter's father. Outside, frost settles across the pasture. Walter closes the binder slowly. Today is the final state infrastructure determination hearing. Not a dramatic courtroom trial. Just another procedural room. That realism matters. Because the story was never about spectacle. It was about patience. At the hearing building in Little Rock, the atmosphere feels exhausted rather than explosive. Overfilled legal carts. Stale coffee. Wrinkled suits. Photocopied exhibits. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Administrative clerks stacking revised filings. Everyone looks tired. Especially Prairie State Regional Bank. Trevor Pike appears older now than when the story began. His confidence disappeared somewhere during the 11-month delay cycle. Mary Ann Voss sits beside him reviewing handwritten notes silently. Walter arrives carrying the same yellow legal pad from the original auction. That detail lands heavily. The same man. The same notebook. The same calm expression. Only now, nobody overlooks him. The hearing unfolds through procedural testimony rather than dramatic speeches. State reviewers summarize findings carefully. Historical continuity language remained unresolved. Emergency agricultural access protections were never formally extinguished. Replacement flood infrastructure requirements were left incomplete. And Prairie State certification filings contained material inconsistencies. No one argues loudly. Because the documents speak clearly now. Mary Ann herself ultimately confirms much of Walter's interpretation. That moment becomes emotionally significant because even the corporation's strongest attorney refuses to distort the evidence. One reviewer asks whether the project can continue through redesign and renewed compliance review. The answer comes cautiously. Possibly. But not under the existing timeline. The state issues its final determination. All major corridor approvals tied to the disputed access route are suspended pending full compliance reconstruction. Prairie State must restart portions of environmental and transportation review. And revised access infrastructure must be independently certified before development resumes. Estimated delay, 11 additional months minimum. The number lands quietly across the room. No gasps. No shouting. Just silence. Because everyone understands what 11 more months means financially. Contract penalties. Investor withdrawals. Financing instability. Public scrutiny. Prairie State's original schedule is effectively destroyed. Walter does not smile. That restraint is essential. He simply writes the determination date carefully onto his yellow legal pad. Trevor watches him for several seconds before finally speaking. You knew this could happen. Walter answers calmly. I knew the records existed. That line becomes the story's final philosophical statement. The hearing adjourns slowly. People pack folders into boxes. Chairs scrape against tile. Coffee cups get thrown away. Corporate representatives exit first. Prairie State executives avoid reporters waiting outside. The emotional collapse remains procedural instead of theatrical, phone calls, tight expressions, silent elevators, investors already discussing withdrawal options. Mary Ann pauses before leaving the hearing room and approaches Walter privately. Their final conversation carries enormous weight because she is the only corporate figure who truly understood him. She says quietly, "You could have settled months ago." Walter nods once. They could have listened years ago. Mary Ann accepts the answer without argument. Before walking away, she places a single document on the table, Prairie State's revised corridor proposal. The redesign permanently preserves the Boone agricultural access protections. Walter studies the document silently after she leaves. No celebration. Just closure. Outside the building, reporters gather around Walter for comments. Cameras wait. Microphones extend forward. Walter clearly hates the attention. One reporter asks the obvious question. How does it feel knowing your filings delayed a $60 million project? Walter adjusts his coat against the wind before answering. Projects shouldn't move faster than records. Then he walks away. That quote spreads across newspapers throughout the state by morning. But the true emotional payoff happens later. Walter and Eli drive home through rural highways beneath fading autumn light. Harvest smoke rises from distant fields while old grain elevators cast long shadows across empty roads. Neither speaks much. The silence feels earned now. When they finally arrive at the farm, Walter carries the archive boxes back inside the house one at a time. Eli notices him separate one folder from the others. It contains his father's original documents. For the first time, Walter places them not beneath the bed or inside storage boxes, but on the bookshelf beside family photographs. The symbolic meaning lands quietly. The fight is no longer unfinished. That night, Walter sits alone on the porch drinking coffee while wind moves through dark pasture grass. The corridor lights glow faintly miles away where construction was supposed to transform the county by now. Instead, the land remains still. Eli eventually steps outside and asks the question lingering since the beginning. Was it worth it? Walter takes a long time answering. Finally he says, when people stop reading history, somebody has to remember it for them. The camera of the story metaphorically pulls back. Unfinished freight roads. Silent machinery. Drainage channels still cutting across farmland. County records safely preserved. Old easements no longer ignored. The ending remains grounded and realistic. Prairie State survives financially but abandons its original development timeline entirely. Several executives quietly resign over the acquisition failures. Regulatory reviews continue for another year. Portions of the project are eventually redesigned around preserved flood access requirements. Walter never becomes famous. Most people outside Arkansas forget the story within months. But inside Millhaven, people remember the old farmer who walked into an auction with an $8,000 deposit and enough patience to freeze a corporation using records everyone else ignored. The final scene returns to the county records office where the story truly began. A young clerk carefully files updated corridor determinations into permanent storage. She places new labels onto archive boxes before sliding them into organized shelving. One label reads, Boone Agricultural Continuity Review. The camera of the story lingers there for a moment. Because in the end, Walter Boone never defeated Prairie State with money, power, or threats. He defeated them with attention. With patience. With records. And with 11 months of silence that cost the bank millions.